The stagecoach wheels locked with a grinding screech against the hard-packed dirt outside the general store, sending a cloud of red dust swirling up around Leora's boots. She stepped down slowly, one hand steadying herself on the iron rail, while the other clutched her small, worn bag against her side. The mountain air bit at her cheeks, carrying the sharp scent of pine resin, hot metal from the nearby forge, and the heavier musk of tired horses. Sunlight slanted through the tall pines that ringed the town, but it did nothing to warm the sudden chill that settled in her chest. Eyes turned toward her at once, dozens of them. She felt the weight of every stare before she saw the faces. Men pausing with their axes, women with baskets of laundry, children peeking from behind their mothers' skirts. The whisper started almost before her feet touched the ground, low and cutting, like blades drawn across stone. "Don't look at her face," a woman's voice murmured. "The fella who wrote for a bride is gonna regret ever putting pen to paper when he sees that mark." Leora's breath caught. The faint scar along her left cheek burned as if the old kitchen fire still lived beneath her skin. Her family had done this. They had arranged the mail order match, packed her onto the stagecoach with false promises of a new life, and sent her west knowing the man waiting for her would take one look and turn away. The scar was their perfect excuse to be rid of her forever. She had carried the hope anyway, foolish as it was, that someone might see past it. Her delicate frame trembled despite the warm afternoon. The torn hem of her faded blue calico dress brushed the dust, a small, ragged reminder of every mile she had traveled alone. She stood frozen, searching the small crowd for any face that might offer kindness. None did. Her heart pounded so hard, she was certain the whole town could hear it. Then, a voice like distant thunder rolled across the street and silenced every whisper. "She's beautiful." The words landed heavy and final. Heads snapped toward the sound. Leora lifted her gaze and saw him, a towering man standing by the hitching post, his broad shoulders blocking the light, his steel-gray eyes fixed not on her scar, but on her entire face, as though he had found something worth looking at. He wore a heavy red and black plaid wool shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the air around him seemed to still. If you have ever stood where every eye judged the one thing you could not change, then you know the weight that pressed on Leora in that moment. And if those two words from a stranger reached something long frozen inside your own heart, perhaps you will stay with this story to the end. Like it if it stirs you. Subscribe so the next part finds you. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done if you had been standing in that dusty street. The man who had been meant to claim her, as his bride pushed forward from the crowd, his face twisting with disgust. What kind of joke is this? Moat never agreed to no scarred woman from back east. Thorn did not raise his voice again. He simply stepped forward, his massive frame creating a wall of quiet authority between Leora and the sneering man. The other man took an involuntary step back. Thorn's presence alone was enough. Leora's legs felt unsteady. She had nowhere to go. No money left. And the stagecoach was already pulling away behind her. The mountain town suddenly felt smaller and colder than the long road she had traveled. Thorn turned to her then. Without a word, he lifted her small bag from her trembling fingers, his large hands handling the worn leather with surprising care, as though it held something breakable. He draped his heavy coat over her shoulders in one smooth motion. The fabric smelled of wood smoke, pine, and honest labor. It swallowed her slim frame completely, its weight settling around her like the first real warmth she had known in weeks. She did not pull away. He gave her a single, slow nod, his steel-gray eyes softening for the briefest moment, before returning to their usual guarded stillness. Then he turned and began walking toward a sturdy wagon hitched at the edge of the street. Leora followed because she had no other choice. Her boots scuffed the dirt beside his much larger ones. The coat sleeves hung past her hands, but she clutched the front of it anyway, holding the borrowed warmth close to her chest. Behind them, the whispers started again. Softer now. Uncertain. but Leora could still feel the stares on her back like cold fingers. She wondered if this giant of a man was simply another kind of cruelty wrapped in silence, or if the words he had spoken in the street had been true. They reached the wagon. Thorn placed her Bayago carefully in the back among crates of supplies, then offered his hand to help her up to the seat. His Payalomo was calloused and warm, steady as the mountains themselves. He did not grip hard. He simply supported her elbow until she was settled, then climbed up beside her, with surprising quiet for a man of his size. The wagon creaked under his weight. He took up the reins, gave them a gentle shake, and the horse began to move. The town fell away behind them. Pine trees closed in on either side of the narrow road, their scent thick and clean. Leora sat very still, the coat heavy across her lap, her torn hem brushing the wooden floorboards. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, because looking at the man beside her felt too much like hoping. After a long while she found her voice, small and uncertain. "Why did you say that?" Thorn did not look at her. His hands remained steady on the reins. "Because it is true." The simple answer settled between them, like a stone dropped into still water. Leora's throat tightened. No one had ever called her beautiful before. Not her family. Not the few people who had bothered to look at her at all. The words felt dangerous, like something that could be taken back at any moment. The wagon climbed steadily. The air grew cooler as the trees thickened and the road grew rougher. Leora pulled the coat tighter around herself. She noticed then, tucked into a small pocket on the inside of the coat, a tiny carved wooden horse no bigger than her thumb. The details were careful. The mane suggested, with a few sure cuts of a knife, it was clearly made for small hands. She stared at it, her quiet emotional reflection turning over and over like a leaf in wind. Who had carved it? Why did this silent mountain man carry a child's toy in his coat? The questions rose sharp and sudden, bringing with them a new kind of fear she had not expected. She had traded the cruelty of the town for the unknown of the mountains, and now she wondered they kept else waited at the end of this road. Thorn glanced once at the carved horse, then back to the reins. He said nothing. The wagon continued its steady climb as the light began to fade between the pines. And Leora sat very still, the small wooden figure burning in her mind, like a question she was not yet ready to ask. The wagon creaked and swayed as the narrow road climbed higher into the pines. Dusk settled quickly between the tall trees, turning the air cool and heavy with the scent of resin and damp earth. Leora kept her hands folded inside the sleeves of Thorn's coat, the heavy wool still holding the warmth of his body. The small carved horse she had noticed earlier now rested on the seat between them, its wooden surface smoothed by years of handling. She did not touch it. She only stared at the road ahead, the betrayal from the town still ringing in her ears like a bell that would not stop. Thorn drove in silence, his large hands steady on the reins. Every so often the wagon jolted over a root or stone, and each time he shifted his weight slightly so she would not be thrown. It was a small thing, barely noticeable. Yet it was the first time in a long while that anyone had moved to keep her from falling. When the trees finally opened into a small clearing, Leora saw the cabin. It sat low and solid against the mountainside, built of dark logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. A lean-to sheltered the horse, and a stack of split wood. The windows were small and shuttered. It looked like a place that had been lived in for a long time, by someone who did not expect company. Thorn brought the wagon to a stop. He climbed down first, then turned and offered his hand to help her. His palm was rough and warm. He did not pull. He simply waited until her fingers rested in his, then steadied her as she stepped to the ground. The coat slipped from one shoulder. Without a word, he lifted it back into place, his fingers brushing the fabric into order before he let go. That was the second small care he gave her, without asking anything in return. He unloaded her bag and his supplies with quiet efficiency, carrying everything to the cabin door in 2 trips. Leora followed, the torn hem of her dress catching once on a low branch. She freed it with a small tug. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, pine and the faint sweetness of dried herbs hanging from a beam. A single lantern sat on the table. Thorn lit it with a match struck against his boot. The flame caught slowly, then grew steady, casting a soft, golden circle of light that pushed the shadows back into the corners. He set her bag near the hearth, then moved to the fireplace. With practiced hands, he arranged kindling and larger logs. The scrape of metal on flint was the only sound for a long moment. When the fire finally took, it crackled low and steady, sending warmth into the room. Thorn stood, brushed his hands on his canvas trousers, and gave her another of his slow, silent nods. Then he crossed to a shelf, took down a chipped enamel mug, and filled it with water from a bucket near the door. He set the mug on the table in front of her chair and pushed it gently toward her with one finger. Steam rose in thin curls. That was the third care he offered without speaking. Leora sat. The chair was sturdy, made for someone much larger than she was. She wrapped Beote's hot hands around the warm mug and let the heat seep into her palms. For the first time since the stagecoach had stopped, her shoulders lowered a fraction. The fire popped. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a low, constant sigh. She looked around the single room. A bed stood in one corner, neatly made with a dark wool blanket. A small table and 2 chairs filled the center. On the mantel above the fire sat the carved wooden horse, and against the far wall, almost hidden in shadow, was a smaller bed no longer than a child's. A faded quilt was folded at its foot. A single wooden soldier, whittled from the same pale wood as the horse, lay on the pillow. Leora's chest tightened. She did not ask. She only looked. And the questions rose like smoke. Whose child slept here? Where was the child now? Why did this silent man carry a toy in his coat and keep a bed ready in his cabin? Thorn sat in the other chair, his large frame making it creak. He stared into the fire for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, as if words cost him something. The man in town. He told everyone your family rode ahead. Said you carried a mark that made you unfit. Told him not to take you. Said it plain. The words landed slowly. Leora felt them sink through her like cold water. She had known her family wanted her gone. She had known the arrangement was never meant to be kind. But hearing that they had written to make certain she would be humiliated in front of strangers, that they had reached across the miles to ensure even this last chance would be taken from her, broke something she had not known was still whole. Her eyes stung. She kept them on the fire because looking at Thorn felt too much like asking for mercy she did not deserve. The betrayal was not new. It was only deeper now, confirmed by a stranger's voice in a mountain town she had never seen before today. Her own blood had made sure the world would look at her scar first and turn away. Thorn did not reach for her. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply sat with the weight of what he had said, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the firelight. After a while he rose, went to the hearth, and ladled something from a pot that had been warming there. He set a bowl in front of her. Simple stew. The smell of venison and root vegetables rose between them. He returned to his chair and waited. Leora lifted the spoon. Her hand trembled once, then steadied. She ate because she was hungry, and because refusing would have been another kind of defeat. The stew was hot and filling. It tasted of care she had not asked for and did not know how to repay. When the bowl was empty, she set the spoon down. The small bed across the room seemed to grow larger in the firelight. She wanted to ask about it. She wanted to know if the child who belonged there was safe, if Thorn had lost someone the way she had lost everyone. But the words stayed behind her teeth. She had already brought enough trouble to this man's door. Asking for more of his story felt like taking something she had not earned. Thorn rose again. He banked the fire with careful movements, then took the chipped mug and refilled it with fresh water from the bucket. He set it beside her once more. This time, before he turned away, he reached into his coat pocket and placed the small carved horse on the table between them. His large finger tapped it once, gently, as if making sure she saw it clearly. Then he walked to the door, checked the latch, and returned to his chair. Outside, the wind picked up. It moaned around the cabin corners and whispered through the chinks between the logs. Leora pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. The fire crackled. The carved horse sat between them like a question. Neither of them had spoken. She stared at Moat fit until the edges blurred. And for the first time since the stagecoach had stopped, she wondered if the mountains would keep her, or if they would only teach her new ways to be alone. Thorn's voice came once more. So quiet she almost missed it. Bed's yours if you want it. Mutluklunk take the floor. He did not wait for an answer. He simply stood, removed his vest, and laid it over the back of his chair. Then he lowered himself to the floor near the hearth, using his rolled coat as a pillow. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. Leora remained at the table. The lantern flame wavered. Across the room, the small bed waited, its quilt folded with the same careful hands that had steadied her on the wagon and given her his coat. She looked at the carved horse one last time. Then she looked at the door. The wind outside had not stopped. It sounded like voices she could not quite hear, and for a long moment, she could not tell if the sound came from the mountain or from the place inside her chest where the betrayal still echoed. She did not move. She only sat, wrapped in a stranger's coat, while the fire burned low and the questions she had not asked grew heavier with every breath. Leora sat at the table long after Thorn's breathing had deepened into sleep. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, painting the log walls in shifting shades of amber and shadow. Outside, the wind had shifted. It no longer moaned around the corners, but carried the first soft patter of rain against the roof. The sound was steady, almost soothing, yet it made the cabin feel smaller and more enclosed than it had an hour ago. She rose at last, moving carefully so the chair would not scrape. Her fingers brushed the carved wooden horse one last time before she left it where it lay. The main bed waited in the corner, its dark wool blanket turned back as though someone had expected a guest. She did not take off the coat Thorn had given her. Instead, she lay down on top of the blanket, pulling the heavy wool up over her shoulders. The mattress smelled faintly of pine and the same wood smoke that clung to everything here. It was softer than she had expected. Sleep did not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces in town again. The sneers, the turned shoulders, the woman who had whispered "Don't look at her face." She saw her family's handwriting in her mind, imagined the letter they must have sent, the careful cruelty of their words. They had not simply sent her away. They had made certain she would be rejected in the most public way possible. The betrayal sat in her chest like a stone that would not shift no matter how she breathed around it. Yet beneath that stone was something else, something she did not yet have a name for. This cabin, this fire, the coat that still carried the warmth of a man she had known for less than a day. Thorn had not asked her name. He had not asked what she had done to deserve such treatment from her own blood. He had simply stood between her and the cruelty, then brought her here. The mountain itself seemed to hold the rest of the world at bay. For the first time since the stagecoach wheels had stopped, Leora felt the edges of her fear soften into something quieter. She turned onto her side. The small bed across the room was just visible in the dying firelight. Its quilt was folded with the same careful hands that had steadied her on the wagon and set the chipped mug in front of her. Whoever the bed belonged to was not here tonight. The carved horse on the table seemed to watch her with its simple wooden eyes. Leora wondered again, whose small hands had played vacate hat it, and why Thorn kept a child's bed ready in a cabin that held only one man. Rain tapped harder on the roof. A single drop found its way through a chink in the logs and landed on the floor with a soft tap. Thorn stirred. He did not wake fully. He simply reached out one long arm, found another log from the stack beside the hearth, and laid it across the coals without opening his eyes. The fire caught again with a low crackle, pushing back the darkness. That small, unconscious act of keeping the warmth alive for her settled something deep in Leora's chest. He had not forgotten she was there. Even in sleep, he tended the space around her. She must have drifted after that, because when she opened her eyes again, the rain had stopped, and gray light filtered through the shuttered window. Thorn was already up. He moved without sound for a man of his size, adding fresh wood to the fire, filling the kettle from the bucket, setting it to heat on the iron hook. He had placed a second blanket at the foot of her bed sometime in the night. She had not felt him do it. The extra wool was folded neatly, as though he had not wanted to disturb her, but had wanted her to be warm. Leora sat up slowly. The coat still covered her. She kept it on. Thorn glanced over once, gave her the same slow nod he had given in town, then returned to his work. He did not speak. He did not ask how she had slept or whether she planned to stay. He simply moved through the small space with the quiet certainty of a man who had decided she belonged here, for as long as she needed the shelter. When the kettle began to steam, he poured hot water into the chipped mug and set it on the table again. This time, he added a small twist of dried mint from one of the bundles hanging overhead. The scent rose, clean and sharp, cutting through the heavier smells of wood and wool. He pushed the mug toward her chair with one finger, the same gesture as the night before. Then he turned to the door, lifted the latch, and stepped outside into the damp morning air. Leora rose and went to the window. Through the gap in the shutters, she watched him cross the clearing to the lean-to. He checked the horse, ran a large hand down its neck, then stood for a long moment, looking out toward the trees. His shoulders were set in that same alert line she had seen when they left town. He was not simply tending the animal, he was watching the mountain, listening to it. Even here, in the sanctuary he had brought her to, he remained aware of what might come up the road behind them. She let the shutter fall closed and returned to the table. The mint water had cooled enough to drink. She wrapped her hands around the mug the way she had the night before, and let the warmth move through her palms into her wrists. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft hiss of the fire and the occasional drip of water from the eaves. It felt like a place that had been waiting for someone, or perhaps it had simply been waiting for the right kind of silence. Thorn came back inside. He carried an armful of split wood and stacked it neatly beside the hearth. Before he sat, he reached across the table and moved the carved wooden horse so it sat directly in front of her. His finger tapped the smooth back once, gently. Then he lowered himself into his chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He did not explain the horse. He did not explain the small bed or the quilt, or why he had kept the fire burning through the night. He only sat kept at her in the gray morning light and let the sanctuary speak for itself. Leora looked at the carved horse. Then she looked at the man across from her. His steel-gray eyes met hers without flinching. In them she saw no pity, no curiosity about her scar, no calculation of what she might be worth or what trouble she might bring. She saw only the same steady presence that had stood between her and the town. The rain began again, softer this time, a gentle tapping that sounded almost like the mountain, itself breathing. Leora took a slow sip of the mint water. The warmth spread through her chest and settled around the stone of betrayal that still lay there. It did not remove the stone. It simply made the weight easier to carry for a little while longer. Thorn rose once more. He went to the door and checked the latch, testing it with his hand as though making certain it would la day against whatever might come. When he turned back, his gaze went first to her, then to the small bed in the corner, then back to the fire. He said nothing. He did not need to. The cabin, the fire, the extra blanket, the mug that had appeared in front of her twice now. All of it said the same thing in the language he seemed to prefer. She was safe here. For now. Leora set the mug down. Her fingers lingered on the rim. Outside, the rain continued its soft rhythm against the roof. Inside, the fire crackled low and steady. Thorn sat across from her in silence, his large hands resting on his knees, his eyes on the flames. The carved horse waited on the table between them, like a promise neither of them had spoken aloud. She did not ask about the child who belonged to the bed or the horse. She did not ask how long she could stay, or what he expected in return for the coat and the fire, and the quiet protection that wrapped around her more surely than any words. The questions stayed where they were, heavy and unspoken, while the rain fell and the mountain kept its own counsel. Thorn's voice came at last, low and rough, almost lost beneath the sound of the rain. No one will come up here unless Mot let them. He did not look at her when he said it. He kept his eyes on the fire. But the words settled into the space between them with the same finality he had used in town when he had called her beautiful. Leora felt them land. She felt the truth of them in the solid logs around her, in the locked door, in the way he had already placed himself between her and anything that might follow. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let the sanctuary be enough. Yet as the gray light strengthened and the rain softened into mist, she found herself listening past the sound of the fire and the rain for the distant creak of wagon wheels or the murmur of voices on the road below. She heard nothing, only the mountain breathing and the man across from her keeping watch in his silence. Still, the question remained, unspoken and unresolved, hanging in the warm air between them like the last curl of steam from the chipped mug. How long could a place this quiet truly keep the world away? Leora remained at the table after Thorn spoke. The rain had softened to a fine mist that tapped against the roof in a steady, patient rhythm. His words, "No one will come up here unless Mot let them," still hung in the warm air between them. She believed him. She also knew that believing was not the same as earning the right to stay. She rose without answering. The chair scraped softly against the floorboards. Thorn watched her, his steel-gray eyes following the movement, but offering no objection. She crossed to the corner, where a worn broom leaned against the wall. The handle was smooth from use, the bristles frayed at the edges. She took it up and began to sweep. The sound of the bristles against the rough floor was rhythmic and small. Dust rose in thin clouds and settled again. She worked methodically, moving from the hearth outward, careful not to disturb the small bed or the folded quilt. Every pass of the broom carried away a little of the grit the rain had tracked in. With each stroke, she felt something inside her settle. Work had always been the one thing no one could take from her. It gave her hands a purpose when her heart had none. Thorn did not speak. He remained in his chair, large hands resting on his knees, watching the steady motion of the broom. After a while he stood. He crossed to the shelf, lifted a dented tin pail, and carried it outside. When he returned, he set it near her without a word. Fresh water from the spring, clear and cold. He had gone out in the mist to bring it for her. That was the first quiet care he gave while she worked. Leora dipped the corner of an old cloth into the water and began to wipe the table. The chipped mug still sat where she had left it. She washed it carefully, then set it upside down to dry. The cabin was small. One person could keep it in order if they moved with intention. She moved with intention now. The torn hem of her blue calico dress brushed the clean floor as she worked. She noticed the way the fabric caught on a splinter and made a mental note to mend it later. Mending was something she knew how to do well. Thorn returned to his chair. He did not offer help. He did not tell her to stop. He simply sat and let her claim the space with her labor. After a time, he rose again. This time, he brought in an armload of wood and stacked it neatly beside the hearth within easy reach. He placed the pieces so she would not have to bend far if she needed to tend the fire herself. That was the second small care. When the floor was swept and the table wiped, Leora looked around for what else could be done. The shelves held sparse supplies: flour in a tin and salt, a sack of dried beans, a few root vegetables. She found a pot and set water to boil on the hook over the fire. She added a handful of beans and a pinch of salt. The smell that rose was plain but honest. While the beans softened, she turned to the small pile of clothes near the bed. Thorn's spare shirt and a pair of heavy socks. She found a needle and thread in a tin on the shelf and sat by the fire to mend a tear in the shirt sleeve. The needle moved steadily through the wool. Her fingers knew the work without thought. Each stitch pulled the fabric closed. Each pull of the thread felt like claiming a small piece of order in a world that had offered her none. Thorn watched the movement of her hands. His posture had changed. He no longer sat like a man guarding a stranger. He sat like a man who had begun to recognize something familiar in the quiet rhythm of another person's work. She did not look up when she spoke. Her voice was low, steady, the same tone she had used when she told the townspeople she would not be a burden. Mort can work. Moat will earn my keep here. I want to take what Mort haven't given back. Thorn was silent for a long moment. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft scrape of her needle. Then he answered, voice rough and short. Stay as long as you need. It was not a promise of forever. It was permission. Leora felt the weight of it settle in her chest. She finished the sleeve, knotted the thread, and bit it clean. When she held the shirt out to him, he took it with both hands. His fingers brushed hers for the briefest moment. The touch was warm and calloused. He did not thank her with words. He simply folded the mended shirt and placed it on the shelf where it belonged. That was the third care he gave without asking. They ate the beans together at the table as the light outside turned from gray to the deeper blue of early evening. The stew was thin but hot. Leora had added a pinch of the dried mint Thorn kept hanging. The scent cut through the heaviness of the beans and made the meal feel less like survival and more like something shared. Thorn ate slowly. He watched her between bites, not with suspicion, but with a quiet attention that made her aware of every small movement she made. When she reached for more water, he had already lifted the pail and poured it for her. After the meal, she washed the pot and the two bowls. Thorn dried them with a cloth and set them back on the shelf. The work of two people in the small space felt different from the work of one. It felt like the beginning of something that might grow if it were allowed to. When the dishes were done, Leora turned to the torn hem of her own dress. She sat near the fire again and began to stitch. The fabric was thin from travel. The stitches had to be small, and even if they were to hold. Thorn remained at the table. He had taken a piece of wood and a small knife from his pocket. He whittled in silence, the shavings falling into a neat pile at his feet. The sound of the blade against the wood was steady and sure. Neither of them spoke. The cabin filled with the small, ordinary sounds of people sharing work and space. Outside, the mist had cleared. A pale evening light slanted through the shutters and touched the edge of the small bed in the corner. Leora's needle paused. She looked at the bed, then at the carved horse still sitting on the table where Thorn had placed it that morning. She wanted to ask. The question sat behind her teeth, heavy and waiting. Instead, she bent her head and continued stitching the hem. Thorn's knife stopped. He set the piece of wood down. It was beginning to take the shape of something small and four-legged, a horse, perhaps, or another figure for small hands. He looked at the bed as well. His shoulders tightened the way they had the night before when she had first noticed it. He did not speak of it. He simply stood, crossed to the door, and checked the latch again, even though no one had come near all day. Leora finished the last stitch on her hem and bit the thread. She stood and shook the dress out. The tear was gone. The fabric hung straighter. She folded it over the back of the chair and turned to face him. Moat can do more tomorrow, she said. Whatever needs doing. Thorn nodded once. His eyes met hers and held. In them she saw something she had not expected: respect. Not for what she had survived, but for what she was willing to give. The look lasted only a moment before he looked away. But it was enough. Something small and new had begun to grow between the work and the silence. He moved to the hearth and banked the fire for the night. Then he lifted the carved horse from the table and carried it to the mantel. He placed it there carefully, as though returning it to a place it was meant to stay. When he turned back, his face was once again the guarded mask she had first seen in town. Leora went to the bed. She did not lie down. She sat on the edge and watched the last of the firelight play across the floor. Thorn lowered himself to the same place. On the floor he had taken the night before. using his coat as a pillow. He did not speak again. The cabin grew quiet. The rain had stopped completely. Somewhere far below, on the road that climbed from town, a branch cracked. It could have been an animal. It could have been something else. Leora's hands tightened on the edge of the blanket. Thorn's eyes opened. He did not sit up. He only turned his head toward the door and listened. Neither of them moved. The sound did not come again. But the question it left behind remained, heavy and unresolved in the warm dark. If someone had followed them up the mountain, after all, the work she had done today would not be enough to protect either of them. Morning came slowly to the cabin. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving the air damp and heavy with the scent of wet pine and fresh earth. Leora woke to the sound of Thorn moving quietly outside, the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood, the low murmur of his voice to the horse. She lay still for a moment, the extra blanket he had placed at the foot of the bed pulled up to her chin. The cabin felt different, cleaner. The floor she had swept the day before showed the grain of the wood instead of layers of dust. The table stood clear, except for the chipped mug, and the small carved horse Thorn had returned to the mantel. She rose and dressed quickly, folding the coat he had given her, and placing it on the chair. The torn hem of her blue calico dress was now neatly stitched. She ran her fingers over the even line of thread and felt a small, private satisfaction. Then she turned to the hearth. The fire had burned low. She added 2 pieces of the wood Thorn had stacked so carefully within reach, and blew gently until the flames caught. The smell of wood smoke rose, familiar now, wrapping around her like the coat had the day before. By the time Thorn came back inside with an armload of split logs, she had water heating and the last of the beans from the night before warming in the pot. She had found a small sack of flour on the shelf and mixed a simple dough with salt and the last of the mint. The flatbread sizzled on the iron pan she had balanced over the coals. The smell that filled the cabin was rich and comforting. Toasted flour, warm beans, the clean sharpness of mint. It pushed back the dampness and the lingering chill of the mountain morning. Thorn stopped just inside the door. His steel-gray eyes moved from the fire to the table she had set veikepine te, hot 2 bowls and 2 spoons, then to the pan where the bread was browning. He did not speak. He simply set the wood down and stood for a long moment, breathing in the scent. Something in his broad shoulders eased. The tight line of his jaw softened by a fraction. He crossed to the table and sat without being asked. That was the first warmth he gave her that morning. The simple act of accepting what she had made without protest or question. Leora turned the bread, her movements steady. She felt his gaze on her back, but did not turn. When the bread was done, she slid it onto a plate and set it between them. She ladled the beans into the bowls and placed one in front of him. The steam rose between them, carrying the scent of the meal she had coaxed from his sparse supplies. Thorn picked up the spoon. He ate slowly, as though tasting a hot bite instead of simply filling his stomach. When he reached for a second piece of flatbread, he paused, looking at her. His eyes held something she had not seen before, quiet appreciation, almost wonder. He did not thank her with words. He simply took the bread and continued eating. That was the second warmth. After the meal, Leora washed the bowls and the pan in the fresh water Thorn had brought earlier. He dried them again, his large hands careful with the chipped enamel. When everything was put away, she turned to the shelves. They were nearly bare, but she rearranged what was there, flour tinned to one side, salt and beans to the other. The small bundle of dried herbs hanging where she could reach them easily. She wiped the shelf surfaces with a damp cloth until they were clean. The cabin was beginning to feel less like a place a man endured and more like a place someone could live. Thorn watched her work. He did not leave to split more wood or check the horse. He stayed inside, sitting at the table with the piece of wood and his knife. The soft scrape of the blade filled the space between them. Leora found a tear in one of his heavy socks and sat by the fire to mend it. The needle moved in and out of the thick wool. Each stitch was small and strong. She worked in silence, the fire crackling beside her, the smell of the morning meal still lingering in the warm air. When she finished the sock, she held it out. Thorn took it, turned it over in his hands and ran his thumb across the neat line of stitches. He set it on the shelf beside the mended shirt from the day before. Then he rose and went to a small chest near the bed. He lifted the lid and took out a folded length of dark wool, an old blanket, worn but clean. He carried it to her and placed it on the table. It was clearly meant for her to use or to make something from. He did not explain. He simply offered it and returned to his chair. That was the third warmth he gave, without asking anything in return. Leora ran her hand over the wool. It was soft from age and washing. She could make a shawl from it or line the small bed in the corner if the child ever returned. The thought of the child came unbidden. She glanced at the folded quilt on the small mattress. The cabin was warmer now, the air filled with the scent of food and clean wood and the faint sweetness of the mint she had used. Her hands had done this. Her skills had turned the sparse supplies and the cold hearth into something that felt like care. For the first time since the stagecoach had stopped, she felt useful instead of merely endured. Thorn whittled in silence. The piece of wood in his hands was taking clearer shape. The curve of a neck, the suggestion of legs, another horse perhaps, or something else. Leora did not ask. She folded the dark wool and set it on the end of her bed. Then she turned back to the hearth and began to clean the ashes from the night before, sweeping them carefully into a tin. The work was ordinary and grounding. With Hot's small task, the cabin felt more like hers to tend. When the fire was clean, she stood and wiped her hands on her apron. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, and the last of the beans, and the faint trace of mint. Sunlight had broken through the mist, and now slanted through the shutters in pale gold lines. It touched the mantel, where the carved horse stood. It touched the small bed in the corner. It touched the table where Thorn still sat, his knife moving steadily. Leora looked at him. He looked back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The connection that had begun with her insistence on working had deepened in the quiet labor of the morning. She had given the cabin life. He had accepted it without resistance. Something fragile and new had started to grow between the broom and the needle and the shared meal. Thorn set the knife down. He reached into the chest again and took out a small folded paper. It was yellowed at the edges, creased from many openings. He did not open it. He simply held it for a moment, his large thumb brushing the corner. Then he placed it back at the chest and closed the lid. His shoulders had tightened again. The guarded look had returned to his eyes. Leora watched him. She did not ask what the paper was. She did not ask about the small bed or the carved horse or the child who belonged to both. But the questions rose anyway, sharp and sudden in the warm, food-scented air. She had made the cabin feel alive again. She had seen Thorn eat, with something close to pleasure. She had felt the beginning of something that might become trust. Yet as he sat with his back a little straighter, and his eyes on the closed chest, she understood that the sanctuary he had given her was built on ground that still held old grief. Her homemaking had filled the space with warmth and scent and order. It had not erased whatever loss lived in the folded paper or the empty small bed. Thorn rose without looking at her. He went to the door, checked the latch, and stepped outside into the sunlight. The sound of his boots on the damp earth faded as he crossed the clearing. Leora remained by the hearth, the dark wool blanket still in her hands. The cabin was quiet again, except for the low crackle of the fire she had tended. She looked at the small bed, then at the carved horse on the mantel, then at the closed chest where the yellowed paper waited. The question she had not asked sat heavy in her chest, heavier than the stone of her family's betrayal had been the night before. She had given this place life with her hands. She had begun to feel something like belonging in the rhythm of the work and the shared silence. But the sanctuary Thorn had offered was not empty. It held rooms she had not yet been invited to enter. And as the sunlight moved across the floor toward the small bed, Leora wondered if the warmth she had brought would be enough to reach the cold places he still kept locked away, or if she had only made the waiting harder for both of them. The supplies ran low faster than either of them expected. Leora had used the last of the flour for flatbread and the last of the beans in the stew that had become their evening meal. The sack of salt was nearly empty. Thread for mending was down to a few inches on the spool. She stood at the shelf one morning, fingers resting on the empty tin, and knew they could not stretch Ve Kep hat. Ate remained much longer, without her skills turning from care into scarcity. Thorn came in from splitting wood and saw her standing there. He did not ask what she needed. He simply looked at the shelf, then at the pot she had scrubbed clean and set to dry, and nodded once. By midday he had the wagon hitched and the horse ready. He brought her the heavy coat again and draped it over her shoulders without a word. The wool still carried the scent of pine smoke and his work. She pulled it close. He helped her up to the wagon seat with the same steady hand he had used the first day, then climbed up beside her. The journey down the mountain began in silence. The road was narrower than she remembered, the trees pressing closer on either side. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in shifting patterns across the wagon bed. The air smelled of damp earth and resin, sharper now that the rain had passed. Leora sat Ve Kip Kit Te hat, her hands folded inside the coat sleeves. She watched the road unwind ahead of them and felt the cabin's warmth recede Ve Kepi Te hat every turn of the wheels. The questions from the night before, the folded paper, the small bed, the carved horse, rode with her. She did not speak them aloud. Thorn kept his eyes on the road, his large hands steady on the reins. Every so often he glanced at her, a quick check that she was warm and settled, before looking forward again. When the trees finally thinned and the town came into view, the air changed. Dust rose from the street. The smell of horses, forged smoke, and human closeness replaced the clean mountain scent. Leora felt her shoulders tighten. Thorn felt it too. His posture changed, shoulders broadening, chin lifting slightly. The quiet authority he carried in the cabin sharpening into something more visible. He drove the wagon straight to the general store and stopped it where the boardwalk would shield her from the worst of the open street. People turned as soon as she stepped down. The same eyes that had stared the day she arrived found her again. The whispers began almost at once, low but carrying on the still air. Don T, look at her face, a woman murmured to her companion as they passed. She is the one the mountain man took in. Another voice, male and rough, added with a short laugh. Guess even a giant gets lonely enough to take what no one else wanted. Leora kept her gaze on the boardwalk boards. The torn hem of her dress, now mended, brushed the wood. She felt the old shame rise, hot and familiar. Then Thorn was there. He had come around the wagon without hurry, his massive frame moving between her and the street like a wall. He did not touch her. He simply stood close enough that anyone who wanted to stare had to look past him first. His steel gray eyes swept the street once, slow and deliberate. The whispers faltered. Some people looked away. Others kept watching, but no longer spoke above a murmur. He placed a hand lightly at the small of her back, not pushing, only guiding, and walked Ve Kepi Te hat her into the store. The bell above the door gave a thin ring. Inside, the air smelled of leather, coffee, and oiled wood. Thorn moved through the narrow aisles Ve Kepi Te hat purpose. He took flour, salt, a new spool of thread, a small packet of dried beans, and a length of sturdy calico in a soft faded blue that matched the one she already wore. When she reached for a bar of lye soap, he added a second without comment. At the counter he paid in coins from a leather pouch and waited, while the clerk wrapped everything in brown paper. Outside again. The stairs had not disappeared. A small cluster of men stood near the hitching post. The same ones who had laughed with the man who was supposed to have claimed her. One of them stepped forward as Thorn loaded the wagon. Taking in strays now. Mountain man, he called. Loud enough for the street to hear. Or is she earning her keep the old way? Thorn finished tying the last bundle. He turned slowly. His height alone made the man take half a step back. He did not raise his voice. He did not clench his fists. He simply looked at the man until the laughter died in the other's throat. Then he spoke. Low and final. She is under my protection. That is all you need to know. The words carried across the street. The cluster of men shifted. No one answered. Thorn turned back to Leora and offered his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. His palm was warm and steady. She took it. As she settled, he draped the coat more securely around her shoulders, tucking the edge so it would not slip. That small adjustment, done in full view of the watching town, said more than any shout could have. He was claiming her presence here as something he would defend. They left without hurry. The wagon wheels turned over the hard-packed dirt and carried them back toward the trees. Leora sat very still inside the coat. The town's cruelty had not changed. The whispers had not softened. But Thorn's presence had turned the stairs into something that could not touch her as deeply as before. She felt the difference in her chest, less like a wound reopening and more like a scar that had already begun to heal under careful hands. On the road upward, the mountain air grew cooler and cleaner again. The smell of pine replaced dust and forge smoke. Sunlight through the trees dappled the wagon bed. Leora looked at the bundles of supplies. Flour, salt, thread, fabric. Enough to keep the cabin warm and fed and mended for weeks. Enough to continue the work she had started. She glanced at Thorn. He drove with the same steady hands, but his jaw had eased. The protective tension he had carried into town was slowly leaving his shoulders. She wanted to thank him. The words sat ready behind her teeth. Instead, she reached into one of the bundles and took out the new spool of thread. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, then placed it carefully in her lap. Thorn saw the movement. He did not speak. He only nodded once, the same slow nod he had given her the first day. The wagon climbed. The town fell away behind them. Leora kept her hands on the thread. The questions from the cabin, the folded paper, the small bed, the carved horse, had not left her. They rode with her now, alongside the new supplies and the memory of Thorn, standing between her and every cruel eye in the street. She had seen what his protection looked like in daylight, in front of people who had tried to break her. It was not loud, it was not violent. It was simply there, solid and unshakable, the same way the mountains themselves stood. Yet as the trees closed around them again, and the wagon carried them higher, she felt a new weight settle. The town had not forgotten her. The whispers had not stopped. And Thorn's quiet defense, while it shielded her, had also drawn a clearer line around them both. She was no longer simply the woman the stagecoach had left behind. She was the woman the mountain man had claimed in front of everyone. The road grew steeper. The horse's hooves struck stone. Leora looked down at the blue calico in the bundle. The fabric Thorn had chosen without being asked. It was the same soft faded blue as her mended dress. She ran her thumb across the folded edge and wondered what it would become in her hands. A new dress, a curtain for the small window, a cover for the child's bed if the child ever returned. Thorn kept his eyes on the road ahead. His silence was the same as it had always been, but something in it had shifted. He had taken her into the teeth of the town's cruelty and brought her out again without letting a single word land on her. That was the protection he had promised. It was real. It was public, and it had cost him nothing he had not already decided to give. Still, as the wagon rounded the last bend before the clearing, Leora felt the old fear stir beneath the new warmth. The sanctuary was no longer only the cabin and the fire and the work of her hands. It was also this man beside her, and the line he had drawn in the dust of the town street. She did not know ove kep, yet what it would cost either of them to keep that line intact. The horse slowed as the clearing came into view. Thorn pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. He climbed down first and turned to help her. His hand was steady. She took it. For a moment, they stood together in the late afternoon light, the bundles of supplies waiting to be carried inside, the carved horse visible through the open shutter on the mantel. Neither of them spoke. The mountain wind moved through the pines with its low, constant sigh. Leora looked at the cabin door, and then at the man who had made its protection possible. The questions she carried felt heavier now than they had that morning. She had seen the town again. She had felt its eyes. She had watched Thorn stand between her and every whisper. And she had begun to understand that the sanctuary he offered was not only a place. It was also a promise he was willing to defend in front of the world that had tried to break her. The wind picked up. A single pine needle drifted down and landed on the sleeve of the coat she still wore. Leora brushed it away. Thorn watched the movement, then turned toward the wagon to begin unloading. She stood a moment longer, the new thread spool still in her hand, and listened to the mountain breathe around them. Somewhere far below, on the road they had just left, a wagon creaked. The sound was faint, almost lost in the trees. It could have been anyone. It could have been no one. But as Thorn paused, kept a bundle in his arms and looked back down the road, Leora saw the same alert stillness in him that she had seen the night they first heard the branch crack. The protection he had given her in town had been public and clear. The question that remained, unspoken between them as they carried the supplies inside, was how long that protection could hold when the mountain itself began to listen for footsteps that were not their own. The supplies Thorn had bought in town lasted longer than Leora expected. With careful measuring and the steady rhythm of her work, the flour and beans stretched across days that began to feel almost ordinary. She baked flatbread in the mornings and mended in the afternoons. The cabin smelled of warm dough and clean wool. Thorn split wood and tended the horse and checked the perimeter each evening with the same quiet vigilance. Neither of them spoke of the fair until the morning Thorn came in from the lean-to and set a small handbill on the table. It was creased from being carried in his pocket. The ink had faded in places, but the words were clear enough. Mountain Town Fair. 3 days from now. Baking. Preserves. Handwork. Ribbons for the best of each. Leora read it twice. She had not thought about fairs or ribbons or public judgment since the day the stagecoach stopped. The memory of whispers still lived under her skin, yet the handbill also carried the scent of possibility. She had new flour. She had thread. She had the dark wool Thorn had given her and the length of faded blue calico. Her hands knew what to do with those things. She looked up at Thorn. He stood near the door, arms crossed, watching her face. He did not ask if she wanted to go. He simply waited. Leora folded the handbill and placed it beside the carved horse on the mantel. Then she turned to the shelf and began measuring flour. Over the next 2 days she baked. She made flatbread first, then a simple pie with the last of the dried apples Thorn kept in a tin. The crust came out golden and flaky because she worked the dough with cold hands and patience. She wrapped the pie carefully in clean cloth and set it on the shelf to keep. Thorn watched her without comment, but each evening he brought in an extra armload of wood so the fire would stay steady while she worked late. That was the first small care he gave while she prepared. On the morning of the fair, the sky was clear, and the air held the sharp promise of autumn. Thorn hitched the wagon early. He helped Leora up with the same steady hand, then placed the wrapped pie on the seat between them so it would not slide. The dark wool blanket she had begun to turn into a shawl lay folded in her lap. She had stitched a small border of even blue thread along one edge. It was simple work, but it was hers. The town looked different with the fair spread across the open ground behind the general store. Tents and tables stood in rows. The smell of roasting meat, fresh bread, and wood smoke hung thick in the air. Children ran between the stalls. Women in clean dresses carried baskets. Men in work shirts gathered near the livestock pens. Music, from a single fiddle, drifted above the voices. Leora felt the old tightness return to her chest as Thorn drove the wagon to the edge of the fairground and stopped. He climbed down first and came around to her side. Before he helped her down, he reached into the wagon bed and lifted the wrapped pie himself. He carried it for her all the way to the long table, where other baked goods were already displayed. He set it down carefully among the pies and loaves and covered dishes. Then he stepped back and stood beside her, his broad shoulders creating a quiet space in the crowd that had already begun to gather. The judging began after noon. An older woman, hot silver hair, and a kind face walked the table, tasting and noting. She paused at Leora's pie, cut a small piece with a clean knife, and tasted it slowly. Her expression did not change, but she made a mark on her paper and moved on. Leora kept her hands folded inside the sleeves of the coat. Thorn had once again draped over her shoulders. She did not look at the faces around her. She looked at Motfaith the pie and at Thorna's hand, resting on the edge of the table near hers. When the judging ended, the silver-haired woman stood on a small platform and read the names. For best simple baking, she called Leora's name. A small ribbon, blue with a gold edge, was handed forward. Leora stepped up to take it. Her fingers trembled once, then steadied. The woman smiled at her, not at the scar, but at her face as a whole. "Well done," the woman said quietly. "That crust had patience in it." Leora managed a nod. She turned to step down and found Thorn already there. He took the ribbon from her and pinned it carefully to the front of the coat she wore. His large fingers worked the pin with surprising delicacy. When it was secure, he stepped back and gave her the same slow nod he had given on the first day. This time his steel-gray eyes held something warmer. Pride, quiet and unmistakable. A few people approached after that. Not many. A woman who had once whispered now offered a small jar of preserves in trade for the pie recipe. A man nodded as he passed and said the bread looked sturdy. The silver-haired judge stopped to admire the stitched border on the dark wool shawl Leora had brought as well. Each small word landed like rain on dry ground. Leora answered when spoken to. She kept her voice low. She did not smile too widely. But inside her chest, something that had been clenched since the stagecoach stopped began to loosen. Thorn stayed beside her the entire time. When the crowd pressed too close, he shifted his weight, so his arm brushed hers. A silent barrier. When a man from the group that had laughed at her on the first day walked by and stared too long, Thorn met his eyes until the man looked away. The protection was the same as it had been in town before. Only now it stood beside her, while people saw her skill, instead of only her scar. As the afternoon light began to slant, Leora walked with Thorn back to the wagon. She carried the ribbon in her hand, because she could not yet bring herself to take it off the coat. The pie had sold or been traded. The shawl border had earned a kind word. She had stood in the same street where whispers had once tried to break her, and had been given something in return. Thorn helped her onto the seat. Before he climbed up himself, he reached into his pocket and took out a small paper twist. He placed it in her lap without a word. Inside were a few sugar crystals and a single peppermint candy, the kind sold at the fair for children. It was the only sweet he had bought. He had bought it for her. The wagon turned toward the mountain road. The sounds of the fair faded behind them. Leora held the ribbon in one hand and the twist of candy in the other. The mountain air go roeve kept colder as the trees closed in. She looked at Thorn's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the light caught the gray in his beard. He had stood with her in front of the town that had tried to shame her. He had let her work be seen. He had given her the small sweetness without being asked. Yet as the wagon climbed and the fair sounds disappeared completely, she felt the old questions return. The ribbon was real. The kind words were real. But Thorn's silence on the seat beside her had deepened again. He had not spoken since they left the fairground. His hands on the reins were steady, but his shoulders had taken on the same guarded set she had seen the night they first heard the branch crack. Leora looked down at the blue ribbon. It caught the last of the sunlight and held it for a moment before the trees swallowed the light. She thought about patience in the crust. She thought of the woman who had once whispered, now offering preserves. She thought of the small kindnesses Thorn had given her in front of everyone. Then she thought of the small bed in the cabin, and the carved horse on the mantel, and the folded yellowed paper in the chest. She thought of the way Thorn's face had changed when he placed the ribbon on her coat. Pride mixed ve kept hot, something older and heavier. The wagon rounded a bend. The clearing came into view. The cabin waited. Smoke already rising from the chimney, because Thorn had banked the fire before they left. Leora held the ribbon tighter. The validation she had received at the fair had been real. It had been public. It had been more than she had dared hope for. But as Thorn stopped the wagon and climbed down, his eyes already scanning the tree line the way he always did, Leora understood that the ribbon could not answer the questions that still lived inside the cabin walls. She could bake and mend and win small ribbons. She could stand beside this man in the daylight of the town. Yet the sanctuary he had given her still held rooms she had not been invited to enter. Thorn lifted the last bundle from the wagon bed and turned toward the door. He paused once, looking back at her on the seat. The ribbon in her hand caught the fading light again. For a moment, his expression softened. Then it closed again, the way it always did when something old stirred behind his eyes. Leora stepped down without his hand this time. She walked beside him to the cabin door. The ribbon stayed in her fingers. The question stayed in her chest. The mountain wind moved through the pines with its low, constant sigh. And somewhere in the sound she thought she heard the faint echo of a child's laughter that was not there. She'd not ask about it. She only followed Thorn inside. The ribbon pressed between her palm and the dark wool of the coat he had given her on the first day. The door closed behind them. The fire crackled low on the hearth. The carved horse stood on the mantel. The small bed waited in the corner. Outside, the wind continued its patient song through the trees. Inside, the questions Leora had carried since the stagecoach stopped grew heavier with every breath she took in the warm, food-scented air of the cabin she had begun to make into a home. The ribbon stayed on the mantel beside the carved horse for 3 days after the fair. Leora did not move it. Each morning, when she lit the fire, she looked at the blue edge catching the light, and remembered the silver-haired woman's words about patience in the crust. She remembered the woman who had once whispered, now offering preserves. She remembered Thorn pinning the ribbon to the coat in front of everyone. The memory helped on the days when the mountain wind sounded too much like old voices. On the 4th morning, she woke to the smell of rain again. Not the heavy rain of the first days, but a soft, steady mist that turned the clearing gray and muffled the sound of the axe. Thorn had gone out early to split wood and check the horse. Leora stood at the hearth, stirring the last of the beans into a thicker stew. The new flour measured for flatbread later. The cabin felt warm and full in the way it had begun to feel when her hands were busy. She heard the footsteps before she saw him. Small feet on wet earth, careful and uneven. When she opened the door, the boy stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trunk of a pine. He was small, perhaps 7 or 8, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a shirt that had been mended too many times with uneven stitches. His eyes were wide and dark and unafraid. He looked at her face the way children look at the sky, curious, open, without judgment. Leora wiped her hands on her apron. The scar along her cheek felt suddenly larger under his gaze. But the boy did not flinch or turn away. He took 1 step forward. Then another. Rain had soaked the shoulders of his shirt. His boots were too big and caked with mud. "You re the lady who made the pie," he said. His voice was small but clear. "At the fair." It smelled like apples and warm. Leora nodded. She did not trust her voice yet. The boy came closer until he stood just outside the door. He smelled of pine needles and damp wool and the faint sweetness of childhood sweat. His eyes never left her face, but they did not linger on the scar. They moved over her, the way they might move over a tree or a river, taking in the whole shape of her. "Mot met hungry," he said simply. She stepped aside without thinking. The boy walked past her into the cabin, as if he had done it many times before. He went straight to the table and sat in the chair Thorn usually used. His feet did not reach the floor. He folded his hands on the wood and waited. Leora ladled stew into the chipped mug she had used the first night. She set it in front of him, with a piece of the flatbread she had baked that morning. The boy ate slowly, the way Thorn did, as if each hat bite mattered. When the mug was empty, He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at her again. "You have kind eyes," he said. "Even with the mark." "My mama said marks mean you survived something." "She had one on her arm from the fire that took our house." Leora sat in the other chair. The words landed softly and stayed. No one had ever spoken of her scar as survival before. No one had ever looked at her face and seen kindness first. The boy's acceptance was so complete, so without calculation, that something tight in her chest loosened for the first time since the stagecoach had stopped. She reached for the dark wool she had been turning into a shawl. There was a tear in the boy's shirt at the shoulder. She threaded a needle with the new blue thread and motioned for him to come closer. He stood without hesitation. She mended the tear with small, careful stitches while he watched her hands. The fire crackled. Rain tapped the roof. The cabin smelled of stew and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the boy's damp hair. When she finished, he looked at the stitches and smiled. It was a small smile, missing one tooth, but it reached his eyes. "Thorn fixes things too," he said. "But his stitches are bigger. Yours are better." Leora felt the name settle between them. Thorn. The boy knew him, of course he did. The small bed, the carved horse. The way Thorn had tensed whenever the child's things were mentioned, she wanted to ask how the boy knew him, where his mother was now, why he had come alone through the rain. The question stayed behind her teeth. She did not want to break the fragile peace of the moment. The door opened. Thorn stood there, rain darkening his plaid shirt, wood in his arms. He saw the boy at once. His steel-gray eyes moved from the mended shirt to the empty mug to Leora's face. Something shifted in his expression. Relief and pain braided so tightly she could not separate them. He set the wood down and crossed to the table. "Elias," he said, voice low. "You should not walk the mountain alone." The boy Elias looked up at him without fear. Mott smelled the stew. "And I wanted to see the lady again. She won the ribbon." Thorn's hand rested briefly on the boy's dark hair. The touch was gentle, almost careful, as though he was afraid of breaking something. He looked at Leora then. His eyes held questions of their own. She nodded once. The boy was welcome. The cabin had room. Elias stayed through the afternoon. He helped Leora sweep the floor, his small hands awkward on the broom but willing. He sat by the fire while she kneaded dough for the evening bread and told her about the fair. How he had watched from behind a tent because he had no money for a ticket. How he had seen Thorn pin the ribbon on her coat. He spoke of his mother without sadness, the way children speak of things that have already become stories. She had gone to the sky 2 winters ago. Thorn had found him in the woods after and brought him here, sometimes, when the nights were too cold in the old lime shack where he now lived, with a distant uncle, who drank too much. Leora listened. She mended another tear in Elias's sleeve while he talked. She gave him a small piece of the peppermint candy Thorn had bought at the fair. The boy's acceptance of her face, of her hands, of the space she took up in the cabin, settled into her like warmth from the fire. For the first time she felt seen not in spite of the scar but alongside it. The boy had not looked away. He had not pitied. He had simply accepted that she was there and that she was kind. Thorn moved through the small space with quiet care. He brought in more wood. He set a blanket on the floor near the hearth for Elias to rest on if he grew tired. He did not send the boy away. When Elias finally stood to leave before the light faded, Thorn walked him to the edge of the clearing and spoke to him in a low voice Leora could not hear. She watched from the door. The boy nodded, then turned and waved at her. With his whole arm, she waved back. The ribbon on the mantel caught the last light as she closed the door. Inside, the cabin felt different. The small bed in the corner no longer looked empty. It looked waiting. The carved horse on the mantel seemed less like a question and more like an answer that had not yet been spoken. Leora sat at the table and ran her fingers over the stitches she had made in Elias's shirt. They were small and even. They would hold. Thorn came back inside. Rain dripped from his hair. He stood near the fire and looked at the mended shirt she had folded on the table. Then he looked at her. His steel gray eyes were tired in a way she had not seen before. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Instead, he reached into his pocket and took out a small folded paper, the same yellowed one she had seen him place in the chest. He set it on the table between them, but did not open it. Leora did not reach for it. She waited. Thorn's voice, when it came, was rougher than the rain. His mother was my sister. The words landed softly in the warm air. Leora felt them settle. The carved horse. The small bed. The way Thorn had tensed and softened around the boy. The folded paper. Everything aligned with a quiet click she felt in her chest rather than heard. She looked at the paper, then at Thorn. Then at the small bed in the corner where Elias had rested his head for a little while. The questions she had carried since the first night were no longer questions. They were a story that had begun long before she arrived and would continue long after she decided whether to stay. Thorn did not open the paper. He did not tell her more. He simply stood by the fire, rain still dripping from his sleeves, and waited for whatever she would say or do next. Leora reached across the table and touched the folded edge of the yellowed paper with one finger. It was thin from handling. She did not open it. She only let her finger rest there for a moment, feeling the weight of what it held and what it did not. Outside, the rain had stopped. The mountain wind moved through the pines with its low, constant sigh. Inside, the fire crackled. The carved horse stood on the mantel. The small bed waited. And between them on the table lay the folded paper that carried the name of a woman Thorn had lost, and a boy who had found his way to Leora's door without fear. She looked at Thorn. He looked back. Neither of them spoke. The ribbon on the mantel caught the firelight and held it for a long moment, before the flame shifted and the light moved on. Leora stood. She crossed to the small bed and smoothed the quilt with both hands. Then she turned to the shelf and took down the extra blanket Thorn had given her the first night. She folded it and placed it at the foot of the small bed, the way he had once placed it at the foot of hers. When she looked up, Thorn was watching her. His eyes were no longer guarded. They were simply tired and open in a way that made her chest ache. She did not ask about the paper. She did not ask what had happened to his sister, or why Elias lived in a lime shack with an uncle who drank. She only nodded once, the same slow nod he had given her so many times. The boy had seen her face and had not turned away. He had eaten her food and let her mend his shirt and told her she had kind eyes. In that acceptance, something in Leora had begun to believe she might be worth more than the whispers had said. Yet as she stood beside the small bed, she had duete made ready. With the folded paper still on the table, and Thorn's eyes heavy with old grief, she felt the first cold thread of fear wind through the warmth the boy had left behind. Elias had come and gone like a question that had not yet been fully asked. And Leora did not yet know if she had the strength to hear the full answer, or if the mountain would let her stay long enough to try. The folded yellowed paper stayed on the table for the rest of the evening. Neither Leora nor Thorn touched it again. She smoothed the quilt on the small bed one last time before she lay down in the larger one. Thorn banked the fire and took his place on the floor near the hearth. The carved horse watched from the mantel. Rain tapped the roof in a soft, steady rhythm that eventually lulled her into a restless sleep. She woke to Thorn's voice, low and urgent. just before dawn. He stood in the doorway with Elias in his arms. The boy's small body was limp, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. Even from across the room, Leora could see the fever, bright flush on his cheeks. His breathing came in short, shallow pulls. "Found him in the line shack," Thorne said. His voice was rough with more than rain. "Uncle, gone again. Boy, burning up." Leora was already moving. She pulled back the quilt on the small bed and stepped aside so Thorne could lay Elias down. The boy's skin was hot to the touch when her fingers brushed his arm. He stirred but did not open his eyes. A low moan escaped him. She had never nursed a child through fever. Her own childhood illnesses had been tended by a mother who had later sent her away. The knowledge of what to do lived in her hands more than in her mind. Cool cloths, boiled water, patience. She hesitated only for the space of one breath, fear rising, sharp and sudden. What if she did this wrong? What if the boy worsened under her care? What if she let herself care and then lost him the way everything else had been lost? Thorne did not wait for her to decide. He crossed to the hearth, added wood, and set the kettle to heat. Then he brought the chipped mug and a clean cloth from the shelf. He placed them on the table beside the small bed and stepped back, giving her the space she needed, while staying close enough to help if she asked. Leora dipped the cloth in the cool water Thorne had brought from the spring. She wrung it out and laid it across Elias' forehead. The boy flinched at the cold, then settled with a small sigh. She changed the cloth every few minutes, her hands steady even when her heart was not. The fever pulled at the boy's small frame. His breathing remained shallow. She spoke to him in a low voice, nonsense words, and half-remembered lullabies from her own childhood, the sound more important than the meaning. Thorne moved around her without speaking. He brought fresh water when the first pail grew warm. He added another log to the fire, so the cabin stayed warm but not stifling. Once, when Leora's hands began to shake from exhaustion and fear, he placed a blanket around her shoulders and left his hand there for a moment. Warm, solid, steady. That was the first warmth he gave her through the long night. By mid-morning the fever had not broken. Elias tossed once and cried out for his mother. The name tore something open in Leora's chest. She had no child of her own. She had been sent away before she could become the kind of woman who might have had one. Yet here was this boy, burning and small and trusting, and her hands knew exactly how to cool his skin and smooth his hair and murmur comfort he might not even hear. She did not let herself think about what it meant that she wanted to stay by this bed until the fever left. She only dipped the cloth again and again, wrung it out, laid it back. The cabin smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and the faint metallic scent of fever. Outside, rain continued to fall in a soft curtain that blurred the clearing. Thorne sat on the floor near the hearth, his back against the wall, his eyes never leaving the small bed. He had not slept. Leora could see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, but he did not move to rest. When she finally stood to stretch her cramped legs, he rose at once and took her place at the bedside. He dipped the cloth himself and laid it on Elias, with the same careful gentleness he had used when he helped her from the wagon the first day. That was the second warmth. The afternoon light was gray and thin when the fever finally broke. Elias's breathing deepened. The flush left his cheeks. He opened his eyes for a moment, saw Leora sitting beside him, and gave her the same small, missing tooth smile he had given her the day before. "You stayed," he whispered. Leora's throat closed. She could only nod. She smoothed the damp hair from his forehead and pulled the quilt higher over his shoulders. The boy's hand found hers and held on with surprising strength for someone so small. He did not let go even when his eyes closed again in true sleep. Thorne stood. He crossed to the shelf and took down the small packet of dried mint. He made tea in the chipped mug and set it beside Leora without a word. The steam rose between them, clean and sharp. He did not leave the cabin. He did not go back to his wood or his horse or his perimeter checks. He stayed near the small bed, his large frame folded on the floor, his presence a quiet wall between the boy and anything that might still threaten him. Leora sat through the afternoon and into the evening. She changed the cloth one last time when Elias stirred. She hummed the same low lullaby she had used in the night. The boy slept deeply now. His small hand still curled around two of her fingers. She did not pull away. The questions she had carried since the stagecoach stopped had not disappeared. They had only changed shape. She was no longer only afraid of being sent away again. She was afraid of what it would do to her if she let herself love this child and then lost him too. The reluctance lived in her chest alongside the warmth. She had stepped into this role without meaning to, and now she did not know how to step back. Thorn rose once more near dusk. He brought the dark wool shawl she had been making and draped it over her shoulders. His hand lingered at the edge of the fabric, not quite touching her, but close enough that she felt the heat of him. That was the third warmth. "He has no one else," Thorn said at last. His voice was rough from the long silence. "His mother, my sister, left him with the uncle when she knew she was dying. Mort check on him when Mort can. The line shack is cold. The uncle is not kind." Leora looked at the sleeping boy, then at the folded yellowed paper still on the table, then at Thorn's face, lined with exhaustion and old grief, and something new that might have been hope. She did not answer with words. She only tightened her fingers gently around Elias' small hand and kept the cool cloth ready on the table beside the bed. The cabin was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire and the steady rain on the roof. The carved horse stood on the mantel. The ribbon from the fair caught the last of the light. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines. Inside, the small bed held a child who had chosen her face without fear. Leora sat between them, the weight of reluctant motherhood settling over her shoulders like the dark wool shawl Thorn had placed there. She had crossed a line she could not uncross. And as Elias slept on, his breathing even at last, she did not yet know if the mountain or the man who had brought her here would let her keep what she had so quietly begun to claim. Elias slept through the night and most of the next day. The fever had broken cleanly. His breathing stayed even and deep. Leora changed the cloth on his forehead one last time in the early afternoon and found his skin cool to the touch. She sat back in the chair beside the small bed and let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Thorn stood in the doorway, watching them both. He had not left the cabin since bringing the boy in. His eyes were tired, but no longer guarded in the same way. When Elias finally woke, he asked for water in a small, raspy voice. Leora helped him drink from the chipped mug. He smiled at her again, the same missing tooth smile, and asked if she would make more flatbread when he felt better. She said yes without thinking. The word came easily. Thorn's mouth curved in the smallest of smiles at the exchange. He did not speak it aloud, but the look he gave her carried the weight of thanks and something deeper. By evening, Elias was sitting up against the pillows, eating a little of the thin broth Leora had made. Color had returned to his cheeks. He talked softly about the fair again, and about how Thorn had once carved him a horse that looked almost like the one on the mantel. When his eyes grew heavy again, Leora tucked the quilt around him and smoothed his hair. He fell asleep holding two of her fingers. The way he had during the fever, she did not pull away. Thorn added wood to the fire and set the kettle to heat. He made mint tea in the chipped mug and placed it on the table between their two chairs. Then he sat. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the flames and the soft, steady sound of Elias breathing in the small bed. Rain had stopped sometime in the afternoon. The air outside the shutters smelled clean and cold. Leora looked at the folded yellowed paper still on the table. She looked at Thorn's large hands resting on his knees. She looked at Motfi, the carved horse on the mantel, and the ribbon from the fair beside it. The questions she had carried since the stagecoach stopped had been answered in pieces. Thorn's sister, the boy, the small bed. But her own story had remained locked inside her chest. The safety of the cabin, the sleeping child who had chosen her without fear, and the man who had stood between her and every cruel whisper, finally made the lock feel ready to open. She began to speak in a low voice, the words coming slowly at first, then in longer streams as the fire popped and settled. She told him about the family she had left behind. The stepmother who had never wanted her, the sisters who had mocked the scar from the kitchen fire when she was 12, the father who had grown silent and distant after her mother died. She told him how they had arranged the mail-order match, not as a chance at a new life, but as a deliberate joke, writing ahead to the man in town to warn him about the damaged goods coming west. They had packed her onto the stagecoach with false smiles and enough money for the journey, but not enough to turn back. The scar had been their excuse. The real reason was simpler and crueler. She had been a reminder of the wife and mother they had lost, and they wanted her gone. Her voice broke once when she spoke of standing on the street the day she arrived, the whispers already starting before her feet touched the dust. She told him how the man who was supposed to claim her had recoiled and laughed, how the town had watched, and how Thorn's voice had cut through it all like thunder. She did not cry at first. The tears came later, quiet and steady, when she reached the part about realizing her own blood had made certain she would be humiliated in front of strangers, so she would never try to return. Thorn listened without interrupting. He did not offer empty comfort or try to soften what she had lived. He simply sat with the weight of her words, his steel-gray eyes steady on her face. When her voice faltered, he reached across the table and placed the chipped mug of mint tea closer to her hand. The steam rose between them. That small gesture, done without words, steadied her enough to finish. She told him the rest in a rush. The years of being made to feel small in her own home, the way her family had used her labor and then discarded her when it suited them. The quiet hope she had carried on the long journey west, that someone might look at her and see more than the mark on her cheek. She spoke of the torn hem of her dress and how she had stitched it herself on the road, determined to arrive with dignity, even if no one else would give it to her. The tears fell onto the table between them. She did not wipe them away. Thorn's hand moved again. This time it covered hers on the table. His paloma was warm and calloused and completely still. He did not squeeze or pat or offer any of the gestures people used when they wanted to make pain smaller. He simply held her hand and let her cry. The fire crackled. Elias breathed softly in the small bed. The carved horse and the blue ribbon watched from the mantel. When the tears finally slowed, Leora looked at their joined hands. She had not expected the relief that came with speaking the full truth in this place. The betrayal had not disappeared. It had only been witnessed by someone who did not turn away from it. Thorn's silence had been its own kind of shelter, steady, unflinching, and completely hers. He did not let go of her hand right away. When he finally did, he stood and crossed to the hearth. He added another log and adjusted the kettle so it would stay warm. Then he returned to his chair and sat again. His eyes met hers across the table. In them, she saw no pity. She saw recognition. He knew what it was to lose family in ways that left scars deeper than any on the skin. Leora looked at the small bed where Elias slept. She looked at the folded yellowed paper. She looked at the man across from her who had brought her to this cabin and stood between her and the world that had tried to break her. The reluctant care she had given the boy had already changed something inside her. Speaking her story aloud had changed something more. Yet as the firelight played across Thorn's face, she felt a new fear rise beneath the relief. She had given him the deepest wound her family had left. He had held it without flinching, but the mountain still held its own dangers. His grief, the boy's uncertain future, the town that might not stay quiet forever. She had begun to care for this place, this child, this man. Caring had always been the first step toward loss in her life. Thorn stood once more. He crossed to the door and checked the latch. The same careful motion he made every night. When he turned back, his eyes went first to the small bed, then to her. He did not speak. He did not need to. The look said what his silence had said since the first day. She was safe here. For now. Leora rose and went to the small bed. She smoothed the quilt over Elias one last time and tucked the dark wool shawl around his shoulders. The boy stirred but did not wake. She stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the edge of the mattress, and let the weight of what she had shared and what she had begun to feel settle fully into her chest. Behind her, Thorn added one more log to the fire. The flames rose, pushing back the shadows in the corners. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and mint, and the faint sweetness of the sleeping child. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines with its low, constant sigh. Leora turned from the small bed. Thorn was watching her from his place by the hearth. The yellowed paper still lay on the table between their chairs. She had bared her deepest betrayal. He had witnessed it without turning away. The sanctuary he had given her had become something more than protection. It had become a place where she could finally speak the truth and be held in the silence that followed. Yet as she looked at him across the firelit room, with the carved horse and the blue ribbon on the mantel and the boy sleeping in the bed she had made ready, Leora felt the first cold thread of new fear wind through the warmth. She had given him her story. She had not yet asked for his in return. And the mountain, for all its shelter, had never promised that two broken people and one small boy could keep the world from finding them again. The fire had burned low again. Leora stood beside the small bed for a long time after she tucked the dark wool shawl around Elias. The boy slept deeply, one small hand curled under his cheek, the quilt rising and falling with each even breath. She could still feel the warmth of his fingers from when he had held hers during the fever. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, mint tea, and the clean damp of rain that had finally stopped. Thorn remained by the hearth. He had not moved since she turned from the bed. His large frame was still, but his eyes followed her when she crossed back to the table and sat in her chair. The yellowed paper lay between them, untouched. The carved horse and the blue ribbon from the fair watched from the mantel in the shifting firelight. He spoke without being asked. His voice was rougher than usual, as though the words had to push past something long held in place. "My sister was the only family Moat had left after our parents died," he said. "She married young, a good man. They had Elias. When he was 3, the fever took her husband. She came to me then. Moat was already living up here. She stayed a winter. Then she left to find work in the mining camps. Said she would send for the boy when she had enough saved." Leora listened. She did not interrupt. She kept her hands folded on the table and let the story come in Thorn's own time. He added a log to the fire. The flames rose, throwing new light across his face. The lines around his eyes deepened in the glow. "She never came back for him," Thorn continued. "A letter came instead. From a woman at the camp. My sister had taken sick. She died before she could earn the money to send for him. The letter said she had been writing to me, asking me to keep the boy safe until she could come. The letter never reached me until after she was gone." He was silent for a long moment. Leora heard only the crackle of the new log and Elias's soft breathing from the small bed. Thorn's hands rested on his knees, the fingers slightly curled, as though holding something that was no longer there. "Moat went down to the camps," he said. "Found the line shack where she had stayed. Found the uncle who had taken the boy in. He was already drinking the money she had left. Moat brought Elias here for a while, tried to keep him. But the town, they said, a single man with no wife had no business raising a child. They threatened to send him to An orphanage. If Mut didn't give him back, so Mut gave him back, and I stayed up here alone. The last word landed heavy in the warm air. Leora felt it settle in her chest. Thorn had chosen the mountain, not because he wanted isolation, but because the world had taken too much and threatened to take the last piece of his family. Living alone had been his way of protecting what little remained. His heart, the memory of his sister, the occasional visits with Elias when he could manage them without drawing the town's eye. He looked at her then. His steel-gray eyes were open in a way she had never seen. No guard. No silence used as armor. Only the raw truth of a man who had sacrificed closeness to keep from losing anyone else. Mut told myself it was enough, he said. The cabin. The wood. The quiet. Then you came. And the boy started coming more often. And now he stopped. His hand moved across the table until it rested near hers. Not quite touching. Now the quiet feels too quiet when you're not in it. Leora felt the words move through her like the warmth from the fire. She had shared her betrayal. He had answered with his own sacred losses. The bond between them had deepened into something neither of them had planned. She saw the sacrifice he had made. Not just living alone, but choosing loneliness over the risk of loving and losing again. It mirrored the way she had locked her heart after her family's cruelty. Two people who had been broken by blood and by loss, sitting in a cabin that had begun to feel like the first real home either of them had known in years. She reached across the table and let her fingers rest against his. His hand was large and warm and steady. He did not pull away. He turned his palm up and closed his fingers gently around hers. The touch was careful and almost reverent, as though he was afraid she might vanish if he held too tightly. They sat that way for a long time. The fire settled into a steady glow. Elias breathed softly in the small bed. The carved horse and the blue ribbon caught the light and held it. Outside, the mountain wind had quieted to a low sigh through the pines. Thorn's thumb moved once across the back of her hand. It was the smallest of gestures, but it carried the weight of everything he had not said aloud. He had opened the door to his grief. He had let her see the cost of the sanctuary he had built, and in doing so, he had given her something she had not known she needed. A man who understood what it was to be betrayed by the people who should have protected you, and who had chosen to protect others anyway. Leora looked at their joined hands, then at the sleeping boy, then at the yellowed paper that still lay between them on the table. She wanted to ask what was inside it. She wanted to know if it held his sister's last words or a drawing from Elias or something else entirely. But the question stayed where it was. This night had already given them enough. Thorn stood at last. He crossed to the hearth and banked the fire, with careful movements so it would last until morning. Then he returned to his chair. He did not let go of her hand until he had to. When he sat again, he placed the chipped mug of mint tea in front of her, refilled and still warm. He did not speak again. He did not need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of shared pain and the first fragile threads of something that might become trust. Or more. Leora lifted the mug ve kepite hat her free hand and took a small sip. The mint was sharp and clean. It cut through the heaviness in her chest. She looked at Thorn across the table. His eyes were on the small bed where Elias slept. The lines of his face had softened in the firelight. He looked less like the towering mountain man who had roared her beauty in the street, and more like a man who had carried too much alone for too long. She wanted to tell him that he did not have to carry it alone anymore. The words sat ready behind her teeth, but she held them. The night had already asked enough of both of them. Tomorrow would bring its own questions. About the paper, about Elias's future, about what the town would say when they learned the mountain man had taken in both a scarred woman and a boy who belonged to neither of them by blood. For now, the fire was warm. The boy was safe. And Thorn's hand had found hers across the table in the quiet after the stories were told. Leora set the mug down. She looked at the yellowed paper one last time. Then she looked at the man across from her, and let the silence hold them both. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines with its low, constant sigh. Inside, the cabin held 3 people who had lost something irreplaceable, and were only now beginning to understand that loss did not have to mean the end of everything. Thorn's eyes met hers across the table. In them, she saw the same question she felt in her own chest. They had shared the deepest wounds. They had not yet decided what to build in the space those wounds had left behind. And as the fire settled into glowing coals, Leora felt the first true fear since the stagecoach had stopped. Not of the town or her family or the whispers, but of the fragile, terrifying hope that had begun to grow in the silence between their joined hands. The blizzard came without warning 2 days later. One moment the sky above the clearing was clear and cold. The next the wind rose with a howl that shook the shutters and sent snow driving sideways across the cabin. Thorn had been splitting extra wood all morning, stacking it high beside the hearth. He had felt the change in the air. Leora had seen it in the set of his shoulders and the way he kept glancing toward the tree line. By midday, the world outside had disappeared into a wall of white. The wind screamed around the logs. Snow piled against the door until it could no longer be opened from the inside. Elias stayed close to the fire, wrapped in the dark wool shawl. Leora had finished stitching. He helped carry small pieces of wood from the stack to the hearth and kept the kettle filled with melted snow. The boy moved with quiet purpose, as though he had lived through storms like this before. Leora kept him near her, one hand often resting on his shoulder while she worked at the table or tended the fire. She felt the chill first in her bones, then in her chest. By evening her hands trembled when she lifted the kettle. Her throat burned. She told herself it was only the cold and the long days of little sleep. She kept moving, stirring the thin stew, checking the shutters, making sure Elias had enough to eat. Thorn watched her with the same steady eyes he had used the night she told her story. He said nothing. He only added another log and placed the chipped mug of hot mint tea in front of her without being asked. The fever took her in the night. One moment she was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in Elias's shirt. The next the world tilted and the flames blurred. She tried to stand and the floor rose to meet her. Thorn caught her before she fell. His arms were strong and warm. He carried her to the larger bed and laid her down with the same careful gentleness he had used with Elias during the fever. She heard him speak to the boy in a low voice, telling him to stay by the fire and keep the kettle hot. Then the darkness pulled her under. She woke to the sound of wind and the feel of cool cloth on her forehead. Thorn was there. He had not left her side. His face was drawn kept hat exhaustion, the lines deeper than she had ever seen them. He changed the cloth, lifted her head to help her drink, and spoke only when he needed to. Drink. Rest. His voice was rough from disuse and worry. He wrapped her in every blanket the cabin held, and then laid his own coat over her as well. The heavy wools smelled of him, pine, wood smoke, and the cold mountain air he had braved to bring in more snow to melt. When the fire threatened to die, he rose without complaint, fed it, and returned to her side before she could fully wake and fear he had gone. Elias helped in the small ways a child could. He brought fresh snow in a tin. He sat on the floor near the bed and told Leora stories in a soft voice about the carved horse and how Thorn had once let him ride the big horse in the lean-to. His presence was a small, steady light in the fevered dark. Leora reached for his hand once when the chills racked her. He held on without fear, his small fingers warm against her burning skin. Thorn went sleep entirely. Shika no eve kept, because every time she surfaced from the fever he was there. Changing the cloth, forcing sips of the mint tea he had boiled with extra care, adjusting the blankets so no cold air could reach her. Once, when the wind screamed loudest and the cabin seemed to shudder, she heard him speak to Elias in that same low voice. Stay close to her. Not have to bring more wood before the door is buried too deep. He went out into the blizzard. Leora heard the door fight against the wind and snow. She heard the howl swallow him for long minutes. When he returned, his beard was white with ice and his hands were raw from the cold. He did not complain. He stacked the wood, fed the fire until it roared, and came back to her side. He placed one large, cold hand against her cheek for a moment, as though reassuring himself she was still there. Then he sat on the floor beside the bed and stayed. In the moments when the fever let her think clearly, Leora watched him through half-closed eyes. She saw the exhaustion carved into every line of his face. She saw the way he moved slower than usual, but never stopped. She saw the sacred sacrifice he was making, not just for her, but for the fragile family they had begun to build in this cabin. He had already lost so much, yet here he was, giving up rest, safety, and warmth to keep her from slipping away into the storm. She wanted to tell him to sleep. She wanted to tell him she was not worth the cost. The words would not come. The fever pulled her under again before she could speak them. By the second day, the blizzard still raged. Snow had buried the windows. The wind had not lessened. Leora's fever burned hotter. Thorn's vigil grew more desperate in its quiet way. He spoke to her more now. Short sentences meant to anchor her to the cabin and to him. You re safe. Elias is here. Moot met here. His voice was the only steady thing in the white roar outside. When she shivered so hard her teeth chattered, he lay down beside her on top of the blankets, his large body a wall of heat against her side. He did not touch her more than that. He simply stayed, lending his warmth the only way he could, without crossing the careful line he had always kept between them. Elias curled on the floor near the hearth with the carved horse in his hands. He watched Thorn with wide, solemn eyes. Once, when Thorn's head nodded from exhaustion, the boy crept over and placed the small wooden horse in Thorn's lap. Thorn's eyes opened. He looked at the boy, then at Leora, and something in his face broke open for a moment before he closed it again. On the third morning the wind finally eased. The snow still fell but softer. Light, pale and gray, filtered through the buried windows. Leora's fever had crested sometime in the night. She woke to find Thorn still beside her, his eyes open, his hand resting near hers on the blanket. He looked worse than she felt. Hollowed out by 2 days without real sleep, his face gaunt from worry and the cold he had endured to keep the fire alive. She tried to sit up. He stopped her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. Rest, he said. The word was barely more than a rasp. Leora looked at him. Really looked. The man who had roared her beauty in the street, who had stood between her and every whisper, who had opened his cabin and his grief, and now his strength to keep her alive, was breaking under the weight of what he had given. She saw the cost in every line of his face and every slow movement of his hands. She reached up and touched his cheek with trembling fingers. The stubble was rough. His skin was cold from the hours he had spent near the door and the fire. You stayed, she whispered. The same words Elias had said to her when the boy's fever broke. Thorn's eyes closed for a moment. When they opened again, they were bright with something she had not seen before. Relief. And a fear so deep it made her chest ache. Moat could lose you too, he said. The words hung in the cold air between them. Outside, the blizzard had begun to ease. Inside, the fire crackled low. Elias slept on the floor near the hearth, the carved horse still in his small hands. Leora lay wrapped in every blanket the cabin held, and Thorn's own coat, her fever finally breaking. She was alive. Thorn, was beside her. But as she looked at Motfi, the exhaustion carved into his face, and felt the weight of what he had sacrificed to keep her here. A new fear rose sharp and cold beneath the warmth of recovery. He had given everything to save her. She did not yet know if she had the strength to carry the cost of that gift, or if the mountain would demand even more before it let them keep what they had so quietly begun to claim. The blizzard eased on the fourth day. The wind dropped from a scream to a low moan, then to nothing. Snow still fell in soft, fat flakes that buried the clearing deeper, but the world outside the cabin no longer felt like it wanted to tear the logs apart. Pale gray light filtered through the shutters. The fire had been CEPT, alive through the worst of it. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, mint tea, and the faint sweetness of the boy who had refused to leave Leora's side. Leora woke clearer than she had in days. Her body felt hollowed out and heavy at the same time. Her throat still burned when she swallowed, but the fever had left her skin cool and her mind sharp. She turned her head on the pillow and found Thorn asleep in the chair beside the bed, his large frame folded in a way that could not have been comfortable. His head rested against the wall. One hand still rested near hers on the blanket, as though he had reached for her even in sleep. Elias sat on the floor near the hearth, with the carved horse in his lap. He looked up when she moved, and gave her the small, missing-tooth smile that had become as familiar as the cabin itself. "You reawake," he whispered. "Thorn said not to wake you. He said you needed the rest more than anything." Leora managed a nod. Her voice came out as a rasp. "How long?" 3 nights and 4 days, the boy answered. He stood and brought her the chipped mug-filled Vekep hot fresh mint tea. His small hands were careful not to spill. Thorn went out twice in the storm for more snow to melt. He wouldn't let me help with that part. She drank slowly. The tea was warm and sharp, and tasted of care she had not earned. Thorn did not wake. His breathing stayed deep and even, the exhaustion of his vigil finally claiming him. Leora watched the rise and fall of his chest, and felt the weight of what he had given settle heavier than the blankets around her. Elias stayed close. He told her in a soft voice about how the snow had buried the door, and how Thorn had dug it clear each time. He told her Thorn had sung once, low and rough, when the fever had made her shiver so hard she could not stop. The boy did not seem to think it strange that the mountain man had sung to her. He only reported it as fact, the way children do when they have seen something true. Leora let the words wash over her. She was too weak to do more than listen. When Elias grew quiet, she reached out and touched his hair. He leaned into the touch without hesitation. The simple acceptance still startled her. She had spent so many years being seen only for the mark on her face. This child saw her hands, her voice, the way she had stayed when he was the one burning with fever. He saw her as someone worth staying beside. Thorn woke an hour later. He sat up slowly, his steel-gray eyes finding her first. Relief moved across his face before he could hide it. He stood, checked the fire, and brought her more tea without being asked. His movements were slower than usual, the cost of the vigil still written in every line of his body. He did not speak of what he had done. He simply placed the mug in her hands and sat again in the chair beside the bed. The days that followed were quiet. The snow kept them inside. Leora grew stronger by small measures. She sat up for longer periods. She ate the broth Elias brought her. She mended small things with slow stitches when her hands would obey. Thorn and Elias moved around her, with the same careful rhythm they had used when she was burning. They did not ask her to do more than she could. They simply made space for her to heal. On the 5th morning after the fever broke, Leora asked for her small bag. Elias brought it from the corner where it had sat since the first day. She opened it with fingers that still trembled slightly. Inside were the few things she had carried from the east. A change of underthings, a small comb, the needle and thread she had used on the road, and a folded piece of paper she had almost forgotten. She had kept the letter her family had sent with her. The one that confirmed the arrangement and the cruel instructions, they had given the man in town. She had not opened it since the day she arrived. She had carried it as a reminder of what she had escaped and what she must never trust again. Her hands shook harder as she unfolded it now. The words were exactly as she remembered. The careful, cold language, the description of her scar as a defect. The clear instruction that the man should reject her publicly, so she would have no choice but to disappear into the mountains, or worse. They had signed it with the family name she no longer claimed. Leora read it once, then she folded it again and pressed it flat against her lap. The old wound, the one she had spoken aloud by the fire only days ago, opened fresh and raw. She had told Thorn everything. She had let herself believe the cabin and the man and the boy could be a new beginning. But the letter was proof that her blood had not simply sent her away. They had made certain she would be broken in the process. She looked at Thorn, still dozing in the chair after another long night of watching over her. She looked at Elias, who had fallen asleep on the floor near the hearth with the carved horse in his arms. She looked at the small bed she had made ready, and the dark wool shawl she had stitched, and the blue ribbon from the fair that still sat on the mantel. Everything she had begun to love lived inside these four walls. And everything she had ever loved before had been taken or turned against her. The fear rose sharp and cold. If her family had gone to such lengths once, what would stop them from trying again? What if word reached them that she had found a place here? What if the town's whispers traveled east and brought more cruelty to this quiet mountain? She had already cost Thorn 2 days of his strength and sleep. She had already pulled Elias into a fever that could have taken him. She had already become another weight on a man who had sacrificed 2 Mo Uge hat already. Leora stood slowly. Her legs were weak, but they held. She crossed to her bag and began to fold the few things she owned. The letter went back inside. She did not look at Thorn or the sleeping boy. She moved as quietly as she could, the way she had moved through her family's house for years. Small, careful, trying not to be a burden. She had almost reached the door when Thorn's voice stopped her. It was rough from sleep and from the vigil, but it was steady. "Where are you going?" Leora did not turn. Her hand rested on the latch. The snow outside had buried the path. The blizzard had eased, but the mountain was still white and silent and unforgiving. She had no plan beyond the need to remove herself before she brought more harm to the only people who had ever looked at her without cruelty. "Mot can stay," she said. The words came out smaller than she intended. "My family, they made sure Mot would ruin anything I touched. Mot already cost you too much. The boy, he deserves better than someone whose own blood wanted her gone." Thorn stood. She heard the chair scrape softly. His footsteps crossed the floor. He stopped behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, but not touching. "You think leaving will protect us?" he said. It was not a question. Leora nodded once. Her fingers tightened on the latch. The letter in her bag felt heavier than all the snow outside. "Mot think staying will only bring more pain," she whispered. "And Mot cannot be the reason you lose one more thing you love." The silence that followed was long. Outside, a branch cracked under the weight of new snow. Inside, Elias stirred on the floor but did not wake. Thorn's breathing stayed even behind her. She waited for him to step aside, to let her go the way everyone else in her life had eventually let her go. He did not move. Instead, his hand came to rest on the door beside hers, large and steady, blocking the latch without force. "You already told me your story," he said, voice low. "Mot already chose to keep you anyway." Leora closed her eyes. The tears she had not shed during the fever burned behind her lids now. She had given him the truth of her betrayal. He had answered with his own losses and his vigil through the storm. And still, she was trying to leave before the world could take this from him too. Thorn's hand did not leave the door. His voice came again. Rough and final, and gentler than anything she had ever heard. "The storm took enough," he said. "It does not get to take you too." Leora stood very still. Her fingers loosened on the latch. The letter in her bag pressed against her side, like a stone she had carried across the country and could not yet put down. She had tried to make the sacred sacrifice of leaving. She had tried to protect the man and the boy who had become her home. But Thorn's hand on the door, and the steady warmth of him behind her, said what his words had not. He was not going to let her go. Not today. Not while the snow still held the mountain in its grip, and the fever had only just left her bones. Leora let her forehead rest against the cold wood of the door. She did not open it. She did not turn around. She only stood there, caught between the letter in her bag and the man who refused to let the past finish what her family had started. Outside, the snow continued to fall in soft, silent flakes. Inside, the fire crackled low. And, between them, the door remained closed, held shut by a hand that had already given everything, and was still willing to give more. The door stayed closed. Leora's forehead rested against the cold wood while Thorn's hand remained beside hers on the latch. Snow continued to fall outside in soft, silent flakes that buried the world deeper. Inside, the fire crackled low and steady. Elias slept on the floor near the hearth, the carved horse still in his small hands. The yellowed letter from her family pressed against her side, inside the bag she had tried to carry away. Thorn did not move his hand. He did not push. He simply stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the layers of blankets and coats she still wore. His breathing was even. His voice, when it came again, was low and rough from the long vigil and from the words he had already given her. "You don't have to carry that letter alone anymore," he said. Leora closed her eyes. The tears she had held back for days finally slipped free. They fell onto the wood of the door and disappeared into the grain. She had tried to leave to protect him. She had tried to make the sacrifice her family had forced on her into something noble. But Thorn's hand on the door, and the steady presence of him behind her, said what she had not yet allowed herself to believe. He was not going to let her go. Not because he pitied her. Not because he felt obligated. Because he had already chosen her, scar, past, fear, and all, and he was not finished choosing. She turned slowly, her back pressed against the door. Thorn's hand stayed, where it was for a moment longer, then lowered. He looked at her with those steel-gray eyes that had first seen her beauty in a dusty street and had never looked away since. Exhaustion lined his face. The 2 days without real sleep had carved hollows beneath his eyes and deepened the lines around his mouth. Yet he stood steady, the same immovable mountain she had first seen when he roared her worth to a town that wanted to break her. He reached into his pocket and took out the small wooden horse Elias had given him during the fever. He held it for a moment between his large fingers, then placed it in her hand. The wood was smooth from years of being carried and carved and loved. It was the same horse that had sat on the mantel the first night she arrived. The same horse that had waited in the small bed's shadow. "Mort carved the first one for my sister when she was carrying him," Thorn said. His voice was quiet, meant only for her. "Mort carved this one after she was gone. Mort told myself it was enough to keep one small thing safe. Then you came, and the boy started coming back, and the quiet stopped being enough." Leora closed her fingers around the carved horse. Its weight was small and solid, and real. She looked at Thorn, and saw the man who had stood between her and every whisper, who had nursed her through a fever that could have taken her, who had opened his grief and his cabin, and now his heart, without asking for anything in return, except that she stay. He took her free hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused, and completely steady. "Moat am not a man who speaks easy words," he said. "Moat have lost too much to offer promises Moat cannot keep. But Moat can offer this. Stay. Not as a guest, not as someone Moat am protecting because the town was cruel. Stay as my wife. Let me give you my name and my cabin and whatever years Moat have left. Let me stand between you and every cruel thing that tries to reach you again. Let the boy have two people who will not send him away." The words settled in the warm air between them, like snow falling on still water. Leora felt them land in the places her family had hollowed out. She felt them settle over the old wound of the letter, and the scar, and the years of being made to feel she was less than whole. Thorn was not offering rescue out of pity. He was offering partnership. He was offering to make the sanctuary they had built together into something permanent and named and witnessed. She looked at the carved horse in her hand. Then at the small bed where Elias slept. Then at the blue ribbon on the mantel and the dark wool shawl she had stitched and the fire that had never gone out, while Thorn kept vigil. She had tried to leave to protect them. He had refused to let her go. And now he was asking her to choose him in return, not because she owed him, but because he saw her as someone worth building a life beside. Leora's voice came out small and trembling and sure. "Yes." The word was barely more than a breath, but it filled the cabin. Thorn's hand tightened gently around hers. His eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened again, the exhaustion was still there, but something brighter had joined it. Relief, wonder, the first true light she had seen in him, since the day he called her beautiful in the street. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned and simple, and completely without performance. It was the same steady care he had shown every time he placed a blanket over her, or changed a cloth on her forehead, or stood between her and the world. Elias stirred on the floor. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and looked at them still standing by the door. His gaze went to their joined hands, then to the carved horse Leora held, then to Thorn's face. The boy smiled the small, missing tooth smile that had changed everything. "Does this mean she is staying?" he asked, voice still thick with sleep. Thorn looked at Leora. She nodded once. The boy's smile widened. He stood and crossed to them, bare feet quiet on the floorboards. He reached up and took Leora's free hand in both of his small ones. "Good," he said simply. "Because Mott already told the horse you were going to be my mama." Leora's breath caught. The word mama landed in the same place the proposal had. It filled spaces she had thought would always stay empty. She looked at Elias, at the trust in his dark eyes, at the way he held her hand as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Then she looked at Thorn, who had sacrificed sleep and safety, and the careful walls he had built around his heart to keep her alive, and to ask her to stay. The storm outside had eased. The snow still fell, but softer now. The mountain was quiet in the way it only became after violence had passed. Inside, the fire crackled. The carved horse rested in her palm. The blue ribbon caught the light from the hearth. Leora stood between the man who had roared her beauty and the boy who had seen her kindness. And for the first time since the stagecoach wheels had stopped, she felt the old fear loosen its grip. She had been sent away as a cruel joke. She had been offered salvation by a man who had lost as much as she had and still chose to open his door. The letter in her bag no longer felt like a stone she had to carry alone. Thorn's hand remained around hers. Elias's small fingers held her other hand. The cabin held them all in its warm, firelit circle. Outside, The snow continued to fall. Inside, the future they had just agreed to build waited for them to name it. Leora looked at Thorn. He looked back. Neither of them spoke the word wife or husband again. They did not need to. The choice had been made in the quiet after the storm. With a carved horse in her hand, and a child between them and a man who had already given everything he had left to keep her here. The salvation he had offered was not loud. It was not a grand gesture in front of a town that might still whisper. It was this, his hand in hers. The boy's trust. The fire that had never gone out. And the simple, unbreakable promise that he would stand between her and every cruel thing for as long as he drew breath. Leora closed her fingers around the carved horse and let the warmth of the cabin and the man and the child settle into the places her family had tried to hollow out forever. She was not leaving. She was staying. And, for the first time, the staying felt like the beginning of something that might finally be hers to keep. The snow melted slowly over the next week. The mountain released its grip in thin streams that ran down the clearing and into the pines. Sunlight returned, in long, pale slants that touched the cabin roof and turned the remaining drifts into glittering white. Leora stood at the door one morning and watched the path reappear. Her strength had returned in small, steady measures. The fever had left no lasting mark, except a deeper appreciation for the warmth of the fire and the hands that had kept it burning. Thorn split the last of the extra wood and stacked it neatly. Elias helped carry the smaller pieces, his small boots leaving prints beside Thorn's larger ones. The boy had not left the cabin since the blizzard. He slept in the small bed every night now. The dark wool shawl Leora had stitched tucked around him. Each morning he woke and looked first for her, as though making sure she was still there. Each morning she was. On the 8th day after the fever broke, Thorn hitched the wagon. The horse stamped and blew steam into the cold air. Thorn checked the harness twice, then turned to Leora where she stood in the doorway with Elias beside her. He did not ask if she was ready. He simply offered his hand to help her up to the seat. She took it. Elias climbed into the back and settled among the blankets they had brought for warmth. The carved horse rested in his lap. The blue ribbon from the fair was pinned to Leora's coat. The road down the mountain was muddy and slow. Patches of snow still clung to the shaded sides of the pines. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin, and the clean sharpness of melting winter. Leora sat close to Thorn on the seat. His arm brushed hers with each sway of the wagon. Neither of them spoke much. The silence between them was full now, filled with the stories they had shared by the fire, the vigil through the storm, and the simple yes she had given when he asked her to stay. The town looked smaller than she remembered. The streets were muddy from the thaw. People moved about their business with the slow pace of those who had also been held inside by the weather. A few heads turned as the wagon passed, but the stares were not the same as before. Some nodded. One woman, the silver-haired judge from the fair, raised a hand in greeting. Leora lifted her hand in return. The motion felt natural now. Thorn stopped the wagon in front of the small wooden building that served as Beotehat Town Hall and gathering place. He helped Leora down, then lifted Elias to the ground. The boy stayed close to her side, one small hand tucked into hers. Thorn carried the carved horse for him. They walked together into the building. The room was simple. Benches lined the walls. A plain wooden table stood at the front. A man in a dark coat waited there, the same justice who had once looked away when the whispers started. Today he met Leora's eyes directly. He nodded once, the same respectful nod Thorn had given her so many times. A handful of people had gathered. The silver-haired woman from the fair sat on the front bench. Two other women who had once turned their backs now sat beside her. A man who had laughed on the first day stood near the back, with his hat in his hands. He did not smile, but he did not look away. Elias stood between Leora and Thorn, the carved horse held carefully in both hands. The justice spoke the simple words. There was no long sermon. There were no flowers or music. There was only the sound of the fire in the small stove and the quiet breathing of the people who had chosen to witness this instead of turning away. Thorn spoke first. His voice was low and steady, the same voice that had once roared across a dusty street. Mort, take this woman as my wife. Mort will stand between her and every cruelty the world tries to bring. Mort will share my name, my cabin, and whatever years Mort have left. She is already my home. This only makes it known. Leora's voice came next. It trembled once, then steadied. Sit. Mort, take this man as my husband. He saw me when others chose not to look. He gave me shelter when Mort had none. He gave me back the worth my own blood tried to take. Mort will stand beside him and the boy who first believed in me. Mort will make this cabin a home for all of us, for as long as Mort draw breath. The justice pronounced them husband and wife. There was no ring to exchange, only the simple wooden horse. Thorn placed in Leora's hands again, and the blue ribbon Elias unpinned from her coat and gave to Thorn to hold. The gestures were small and without fanfare. They were enough. The silver-haired woman came forward after. She pressed a small jar of preserves into Leora's hands, the same kind she had offered at the fair. Welcome home, she said quietly. Her eyes held no pity, only recognition. The other women nodded as they passed. One touched Leora's arm briefly. The man at the back tipped his hat. None of them mentioned the scar. None of them whispered. The town had not changed completely. But these few had chosen to see what Thorn had seen from the beginning. They returned to the wagon, as the afternoon light slanted long across the muddy street. Elias climbed into the back and settled with the carved horse and the ribbon. Thorn helped Leora up, then climbed beside her. His hand found hers on the seat. He did not let go for the entire slow climb back up the mountain. The cabin waited exactly as they had left it. Smoke rose from the chimney. The door stood solid against the cold. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. The small bed was made with the dark wool shawl. The mantel held the place where the carved horse would rest again. They ate a simple meal together at the table, stew and flatbread, and the preserves the silver-haired woman had given. Elias talked softly about the ceremony and how the carved horse had been part of it. Thorn listened with the same quiet attention he had always given the boy. Leora watched them both and felt the last of the old fear finally loosen. After the meal, Thorn banked the fire. Elias climbed into the small bed without being asked and pulled the shawl up to his chin. He looked at Leora from across the room. Good night, Mama, he said, the word still new and careful on his tongue. Leora crossed to him and smoothed his hair. She kissed his forehead the way she had once wished someone would kiss hers. Good night, my boy, she answered. Thorn waited by the larger bed. When she turned to him, he opened his arms without a word. She stepped into them. His embrace was warm and solid and completely without demand. He held her the way he had held her through the fever, steady, present now, and willing to stay as long as she needed. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines with its low, constant sigh. Inside, the cabin held the three of them in its circle of firelight and quiet. The cruel joke that had sent Leora west had become something else entirely. It had become a destiny shaped by a man who saw beauty where others saw only a scar, a boy who chose kindness over fear, and a woman who had learned that worth was not something that could be taken by blood or by gossip. It had become a home. Leora rested her head against Thorn's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. The letter from her family still existed somewhere in her bag. She had not thrown it away. She did not need to. It no longer held power over the life she had chosen. The scar on her cheek remained. It would always remain. But it no longer defined the reflection she saw when she looked in the small mirror above the wash basin. She was Leora. Wife. Mother. Woman who had been sent away as a joke and had instead been given a family that chose her every single day. Thorn's arms tightened gently around her. Elias slept peacefully in the small bed. The carved horse rested on the mantel beside the blue ribbon. The fire crackled low and steady. Outside, the mountain kept its ancient watch. Inside, the cruel joke had become a beautiful destiny. And for the first time in her life, Leora knew with certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The mountain air was crisp the morning after the simple ceremony, carrying the clean scent of melting snow and pine. Leora stood on the cabin porch with a mug of mint tea warming her hands, watching Elias chase a pine cone across the clearing, while Thorn split the last of the winter wood. The boyish laughter rang out bright and unafraid, echoing off the trees in a way that made the whole mountain feel smaller and kinder. Thorn paused in his work to watch the child too. His steel-gray eyes, soft with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with protection. In that moment, Leora understood the full arc of the story she now lived inside. She had arrived on a stagecoach carrying nothing but a torn dress, a scar, and a letter meant to break her. She had been met avec hat whispers and rejection, saved by a roar that named her beautiful when the world tried to name her worthless. She had learned to work and to heal and to love in the quiet rhythm of this cabin. She had nearly walked away to protect the very people who had taught her she was worth staying for. And in the end, she had been claimed, not as a joke or a burden, but as a wife, a mother, and a woman whose face and heart were finally seen as whole. The cruel joke her family had crafted had become the most beautiful destiny she could have imagined. Thorn crossed the clearing and handed her a small piece of split wood shaped like the beginning of another carved horse. His fingers brushed hers, steady and warm. Elias ran up and pressed the blue ribbon into her free hand, declaring it belonged on the mantle now that they were a real family. Leora looked at the two of them. The giant mountain man, who had given up solitude to stand between her and every shadow, and the small boy who had first taught her that her scar did not define her worth, and felt the last tight place in her chest finally loosen into something like peace. This was what happened when protection chose love instead of fear. This was Heartfelt. Happened when a child saw past a mark to the kindness beneath it. This was Heartfelt. Happened when a woman who had been sent away as punishment was instead given a home that would never send her away again. The mountain wind moved gently through the pines. The fire inside the cabin waited to be tended, and Leora, for the first time in her life, knew she was not merely surviving. She was home. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The story emphasizes themes of emotional healing, protection, and family without graphic content, in keeping with family-safe guidelines.